Welcome, Al and Jim. Al, I have a question for you to start us off today. What is a freedom of navigation operation?
That's something we've been running for decades. I think it started in places like South America. There's a couple of choke points there which are disputed as to who can go and who can't. But of course, when China started with the South China Sea business, uh, they were running FONOPs regularly, in fact, frequently, in South China Sea, and of course also running carrier groups. Normally a FONOP is done with a destroyer or even a frigate if it's a minor dispute. But they've started running carrier task groups through the Taiwan Straits. So, yeah, China.
So, Al,
Yeah, they
what's the basis for doing these types of things?
um, use it or lose it, basically. Like even during the height of the Cold War, non-Soviet bloc ships never entered the Sea of Okhotsk, which is that huge sea north of Japan, up against Siberia. Because before the Cold War, no one had ever entered it because there was nothing to do up there except for Russian ships going and picking up whale oil or timber or whatever the hell.
And slave labor camps like Magadan.
Yes, of course. And so right almost immediately after the wall fell, the U.S. Navy began running freedom of navigation cruises into the Sea of O. And I can recall sailors, former ship captains, naval officers kidding each other of the most interesting place they'd sailed, right? And one of them like aced everybody by saying, "Well, I've sailed the Sea of O," But like during the Cold War, we would annually send a destroyer or two, almost like clockwork, into the Black Sea. Just to make sure that the Black Sea was not just a lake for the littoral countries, and doing it in various other parts of the world to make sure that we legally could have a ship there. So
And the Turks appreciated it.
yes,
Back when they
yes, the
appreciated
Turks did
things we
appreciate
did.
that. Then, I'm not sure they do now. We don't know. Although it's interesting that that's on Turkey, which is another matter. But the South China Seas is a peculiar thing because if you look at old maps of the seas there, disregarding territorial claims or whatnot, virtually the entire central portion of the South China Sea is called foul ground. It's right there on the map, right?
Hmm.
Foul ground. Don't go here because you're liable to run aground on a reef or a rock or something unless you really know the seas here and unless the weather is absolutely beautiful.
Or a shifting sandbar.
Or a sifting sandbar,
That's
sure.
the most diabolical of all.
Yeah.
You couldn't chart them.
And
They kept moving.
the number of shipwrecks there is astonishing,
Yeah.
which is why most of the traffic was along the coasts. Even though if you looked at it, if you looked superficially at a map, you would say, well, why can't you just sail straight from Singapore to Hong Kong? Yeah, well, you'd probably not make it. Even in the Second World War, when I can't remember, it was the Third Fleet or the Fifth Fleet, made a humongous raid into the China Seas, they were really careful to keep away from the areas, that were marked foul ground. And fortunately, that area had been extremely well mapped, as opposed to other areas across the South Pacific where we were using maps that were 100 years old. But of course, the Chinese claiming all these islands is kind of shaky. I mean, they're resorting to maps that were published 200 years ago in some cases, or that China had an outpost here 200 years ago. So it's sort of like the dispute, the Falklands Island business. Spain gave the islands to Britain in the 1770s. But Argentina still says they're part of Argentina, The Chinese are claiming territory that if it had been Chinese, it was Chinese 200, 300, 400 years ago. which raises questions as to why can't other countries lay claims like that? And the only answer to that is other countries just don't have the muscle that China has.
Yeah, and China does not want a war, does not want to fight over it. Even more so when you look closely at their fleet. They're building a lot of ships. I mean, they're mass producing, large destroyers, the equivalent, at least in weight, but also in a lot of VLS, vertical launch system tubes. But they've been having a problem increasingly over the last 5-10 years. Is they can't get enough sailors to man these ships. And actually, we have a piece coming up in probably next week. I'll run it just to get it out there about the Chinese Institute for Military Health Management. Ran an article in the military journal, Military Medicine. They have a serious problem when they put it out there in public. They try and keep, disasters secret as long as possible, but they're looking for solutions. They're trying to stir up, how should I put it, nationalistic zeal among reluctant Chinese, because they really depend on volunteers. They technically have conscription, but, for over 10 years now, since they started downsizing the military, partially that was because they were trying to achieve a Western-style military with trained professionals, but they ran straight into the labor shortage created by the one-child policy, which started in the 1980s, was vigorously enforced. Women were forced to have abortions, et cetera, et cetera. Even corruption couldn't slow it down, except in the countryside. And now they literally are running out of workers. The wages are going up. If you want to have a low cost East Asian, manufacturer, you go to Vietnam, or other places, even Taiwan, Malaysia, what have you. But the problem with the submarine service is they're trying to create a modern navy by doing what the British did before us, and then what we did in the 19th and 20th century by keeping ships at sea a lot. Now, this is expensive. It's wear and tear when you're at sea, but also it trains the sailors because their biggest danger has always been the sea. The enemy, is an extra risk, but you have it every day, especially with the typhoons in the South China Sea and other areas. That's another problem the Chinese haven't come up against yet. They haven't hit a major typhoon. Normally the typhoons come through, hit the Philippines. Philippines is right in their way, so to speak. But then they usually veer off to the north and head for southern China. But sometimes a really big one, Category 5, whatever it is, will blow right through, literally through the Philippines, gather strength again. Basically, a typhoon is a Pacific hurricane, but they're bigger. Everything is bigger in the Pacific and nastier. And they will then plow through the South China Sea. And the Chinese have been diligently trying to dig up records as to how much that has, modified the maritime, geography. That's when I was talking about the foul waters. That's what causes it. I mean, not just the major storms, but even minor storms. You have the shifting sandbars. Even if you map them, you got to keep mapping them. It's the damn things move around. But they've created these new islands by dredging up sand, which is, talk about building your fortress on sand instead of rock. There isn't not enough rock. And they only have a few of their major bases on actual islands, and they're not very big islands. I think in Spratly, the Sansa, the capital of the new municipality of the South China Sea, as the Chinese call it. But all the major new bases they're putting up are basically built on sand. And when a big typhoon hits a pile of recently deposited sand, the pile normally disappears or turns into a shifting sandbank. So they have real problems in there. But the biggest one is they haven't got enough sailors.
Yeah, these bases are also very low.
Yes.
And even if they weren't made out of sand, you get a good storm, you're going to have a problem.
Yeah.
If you look at a map of the Hawaiian Islands, there's that long tail of tiny little islands that goes off to the northwest, and heading towards Midway, and about halfway between there's this French frigate shoal, which is a the top of a very ancient volcano, and there's a place called one of the islands was turned into a little airstrip in the Second World War. If you see an aerial photograph, it looks like an aircraft carrier. And so the Coast Guard for years maintained the station there, and every time the weather reports were bad, they would just evacuate the guys, and frequently it's rock, I mean it's coral and rock, but because the water would wash right over the thing. And
yes,
these little islands there.
As New York discovered in 2012 in Sandy, the surge is what really did most of the damage.
Yeah.
I grew up on the Hudson River, and every 10 to 15 years we'd have a surge coming up the Hudson, and low-lying property would suddenly, be damaged.
Yeah, so like the typhoon could wash right over some of these islands, and all that nice equipment and whatnot is just going to be useless. And I've seen some evidence that the hasty construction is already creating problems, because even building with sand, if you're going to build with sand, you should let it lie for a while so it settles, and and then pile some more on and let that settle for a while. And they're doing these things almost overnight, and so now that the sand has had time to settle, they're probably going to have cracked runways, and if they want to keep pouring money into the place, that's okay.
Another problem they have is the climate. The Southern Fleet, before the South China Sea endeavor began, was, a minor operation, mainly concerned with smugglers and what have you. But since they started with the South China Sea claim, they've built a major submarine base down on Hainan Island. That's that big island off the southern coast of China, a very large island. It's not going to blow away. But the climate is something most Chinese are from the north, or from inland areas, and they're not used to this. And the Chinese ships only started getting air conditioning in the 1980s. The Russians had what they called air conditioning in the ships they sold the Chinese, and the Chinese found that it worked in the Northern Fleet, or now they have a Central Fleet off Shanghai. But the Northern Fleet is up there by, opposite North Korea and South Korea, and that weather is fairly typical of New York, New England, and what have you. So, air conditioning is not an essential. But down south of Hong Kong and Hainan Island, it's very tropical. And they wrote this psychological report of submarine sailors from the Southern Fleet, where they have a lot of their submarines, and they had them to sea a lot. They have air conditioning, but they want better air conditioning because they can't keep up. And they found that 21% of the sailors were suffering severe psychological problems for all that time at sea and all that heat. And when they publish it in an open military journal, the medical journal of military medicine, I believe it's called, it means they're desperate for solutions. Anybody who's got anything, pipe in, write the letter to the editor, and sometimes they find solutions. But this one is mainly a matter of money, and mainly a matter of not being able to get enough young Chinese, especially officers, who they can turn into career, personnel. They can't get them, and they can't keep them. And this is a problem with all submarine services. The Australian. And I know the Australians had a lot of problems with it. They have 6 or so large ocean-going submarines, and they simply couldn't get enough qualified Aussies to enlist and stay. And at one point, I think they had several of their Collins-class subs were tied up because there simply weren't enough people to put them to sea. Chinese are running into the same problem. And they don't want to send a lot of submarines to sea with guys with psychological problems.
I would suspect that they may be getting a lot of farm boys volunteering because, if you're an urban type guy, service in the Chinese Navy is probably a little austere, and you probably can get a better job in some of the industries that are there. But if you're, off from some farm somewhere and you want to see, a better life, you join up thinking it's going to be great, because it sounds great, and then you discover that you're on this submarine in the middle of nowhere, and you have absolutely no privacy, and that requires a whole lot of adjustments.
Yeah, another problem with the Chinese Navy. Now they're trying to change this, but basically they have the old Soviet system where they run the draft, or you can join up twice a year, or once a year. Now it's down to twice a year, and they're slowly trying to convert over to the Western system where the enlistments are continuous. But what they do is they only give each sailors, about a couple of months of basic training on how not to get yourself killed while on board a ship. But then they have to get their technical training, especially for the initial enlistment is 2 years. And this is basically a tryout period, both for the Navy and for the sailor. And they find a lot of guys just haven't got it. I mean, that's where the psychological problems comes. Almost all of the 500, the 100 or so sailors who exhibited these problems were first term. And these guys were on submarines, and they were getting on-the-job training. And that's not a place for OJT. But the Chinese, they can't turn on a dime with things like this. And they're applying it to the Army, Navy, and the Air Force. But again, they're running into the problem is there are not enough Chinese who are willing to spend, even 2 years on all these spiffy new ships out in the middle of nowhere. They first discovered the morale problems with the surface fleet when they started sending ships to the Somalia Anti-Piracy Task Force in 2008. And these guys would basically be out there for a 3-month tour. Actually, it's 5 months, between the transit time. But then they decided, well, since we got them out there, let's send them to places where the Chinese warships has never been before. So they made all these extended visits to Europe, East Africa. They hadn't seen any Chinese warships since Admiral Yen came through before Columbus with his tribute fleet. And when he got it back, the emperor said, "That's nice, burn it, and we'll file the records away." But nowadays they can't afford, to get rid of the fleet. They need it. China is no longer a continental power, which is largely self-sufficient. They absolutely have to have access to the sea. And it's hard enough getting Chinese merchant marine sailors, although they can hire a lot of foreigners. That's how they maintain their big fishing fleet. They have, Chinese, captains and mates, but almost all the crew are non-Chinese, hired often at very low wages and what have you, whatever they can get away with. But their fishing fleet has grown enormously in the last 10 years, and some of them, of course, signed up, make a few extra bucks by joining the Naval militia, which is when you see pictures of or video of crowds of Chinese fishing ships, trying to prevent warships or usually, other non-Chinese fishing boats from entering areas where the Chinese want to restrict access so they can get all the fish. These are the militia, which are called up like a reservist. They're called up into active service, as it were. And the Chinese government will pay for any damage that's done because they sometimes ram or allow themselves to be rammed and what have you. There's some chance of injury or death, but that's relatively rare compared to the the dangers of fishing on the high seas. But again, it's a personnel problem, and they can't hire foreigners to serve on their warships. Yet they can't get enough qualified Chinese, and they don't want unqualified Chinese in all these spiffy new ships. So they're caught in a real conundrum, which you don't read about much in the mass media. They just talk about the number of ships, not realizing the quality factor, as it were.
Yes, and of course the number of ships in the case of the Chinese, they do have some impressive larger vessels, but the so-called 800 ships, an awful lot of them, are brown water or blue water restricted, and brown water or green water restricted. So. Well, they may be useful for, wars with some of the local navies, since there's going to be a lot of coastal operations. Blue water operations, they may not be much help.
Well, what they've done with their brown water, fleet is they've taken a lot of the older corvettes and frigates, which they were going to retire as new ones, modern Western design ships were coming online, and they simply disarm them. They take off some of the weapons, if not all the weapons, and turn them into Coast Guard ships, or simply, brown water patrol ships, which is essentially Coast Guard. In fact, it's only in the last decade or so that they formed a Coast Guard. Before that, they had half a dozen different maritime police agencies, all operating with that much coordination. So they finally solved that problem. And so they've got a lot of coastal patrol, far more than in the past. But a lot of them are also available for secondary duty for intimidation operations.
Yeah. So one of the things, Al, is going back to the freedom of navigation issue, is that the United States has been doing FONOPs through the South China Sea to, maintain the rights of navigation. But there are other countries now becoming involved. Is that correct?
Yes. Now there's a number of different issues, I guess. It's also tied up with the South China Sea is this humongously important oil supply route for China. And that's probably one reason why the Chinese are interested in these islands, aside from the fact that they may or may not be oil or whatever the heck else under them. So many of the countries sort of on the route from the Middle East to China have begun visiting the South China Seas or taking part in joint exercises. The French recently sending a little task force, and I believe that a German ship is going to accompany it, which has gotten the Chinese really upset for some reason. But on the way, they're going to be exercising with, I think, the Indian Navy and several other navies, and then they're going to get into the South China Seas, and presumably they'll do some little maneuvers with, some of the local navies, Malaysia and Vietnam.
And Indonesia and Vietnam.
Indonesia, yeah. Because these countries want to make sure that they have access to this. This trade route beyond, it becomes totally dominated by the Chinese. It's going to be a real problem. And of course, in the case of France, you have considerable French territory in the Pacific, which we don't usually think about. But the French Polynesia and New Caledonia and are there. So they want to make sure that they maintain their communications with those places, and China's a lot closer to those places than France is. So visiting the area is quite helpful. Whether the British will be taking part is difficult to say, because the Royal Navy seems to be almost all spearhead and no shaft, so to speak. They've got two marvelous aircraft carriers, but they barely have enough escorts. And then what about the tail to bring the oil and the bullets and the beans, so to speak? But yeah.
And is one of those new carriers called Prince of Wales?
Well, Prince of Wales is the newest one. One.
And the British had an unfortunate incident when they sent the pride of their World War II fleet, the Prince of Wales,
yes,
into Japanese contested waters.
Yeah. And
the poor prince sank.
Yeah. Well, that was of course a wonderful example of lack of coordination between the various services, as well as excessive ambition on the part of a commanding officer who hadn't been to sea in years, apparently.
Another problem we don't really have a good grasp of is China has been hacking the crap out of the United States. Now, we don't hear about the way the West has, but especially the United States, has been hacking its way into Chinese systems. We run regularly an article on the computer security situation inside of China. And it's pretty dismal, because a lot of their computer users are first generation.
Yeah.
And so they haven't got a lot of, how should I put it, experienced systems operators and, computer experts in general. And that's one reason why they have so many hackers, because a lot of young Chinese with the computer skills, they look at the jobs that are available to them, especially from state-owned firms. There are a lot of those, and they realize they can make more money hacking, because the Chinese government will not prosecute as long as they carry out a certain number of patriotic hacks. This is all off the books, of course. But Russia did the same thing. And these are a problem because you don't know until the shooting starts how much your systems have been compromised. And people talk about a digital Pearl Harbor. Well, this is it. It'll be different this time. And that's something the Navy is scrambling big time to try and assess how vulnerable are they? How vulnerable are we, and how vulnerable are they? And those are secrets. That's things you never hear talked about. It's so classified because, you don't want the enemy to know how much they got them by the whatever. But, the Chinese often get cocky compared to the more disciplined Russian hackers, and they show off. And that's how we find out so many of these hacks can be traced definitively back to China. A lot of the North Korean hacks are traced back to China because the internet is so lame inside of North Korea that China has an off the books exchange agreement where they allow North Korean hackers to set up shop in China as long as they pay tribute in kind. In other words, when there's a big hack operation needed, they will enlist their North Korean younger brothers, as it were, to play a part. So this is something that's really off the radar. And, it's not something that was ever a hot news story anyway, because, it requires visuals to go with it. And let's face it, there's not a whole lot of visual about a bunch of, Korean and Chinese nerds, pounding away on their computers doing God knows what.
Yeah. And of course, there's no way of, like we have frequent news articles about how we're being hacked to death and so on. And of course, there's no way of knowing, as you say, what we're doing to them and how
they don't talk about it. We don't talk about it, but we know about it because enough Chinese get out. And in fact, there are information brokers. They started in North Korea, in Northeast China, where they found that Western news agencies and Western intelligence agencies would pay big bucks for a steady stream of, verifiable information. And the same thing happened to China. That's why a recent scandal in the CIA, where they had compromised our agents' identities, shut down a lot of valuable, information gathering networks inside of China. Again, there's the impact of intelligence superiority. Yeah. They have turned that to their advantage big time, and we don't know just how big.
This would be comparable to intel ops in World War II and even World War I, where we're now sometimes finding out the double and triple and quadruple and quintuple agents that were around, feeding information back and forth. And usually it's just a bunch of scholars who've discovered it, so the average person doesn't have a clue that this was going on.
Well, I think it was in the 70s and the 80s where they finally declassified, again, as Al pointed out, because it was leaking out anyway, that the British had the double cross system, and then, of course, there was Ultra, the cracking of the Enigma coding machines. The British kept the double cross system quiet. What double cross was, they had basically identified and compromised every agent Germany tried to insert into either by persuasion or putting their own people into Britain. And most of them they were able to successfully turn. And so the only way the Chinese could check if somebody had been turned was basically to contact another one of their unbeknownst to them turned agents to go check on so-and-so. And occasionally the British would burn one of their turned agents simply to maintain the credibility of the guys who hadn't been burned yet. But that was kept secret for decades after World War II because they were hoping to do the same thing in Russia and China. Russia was aware of it because of all the lefty, Brits who defected. and it
but
became.
we're still even learning new stuff about the skullduggery that was going on, and it'd probably be another 100 years before we suddenly discover a musty file that Hitler's chauffeur or something was actually feeding us information.
Yeah, the Russians benefited from that because again it was very fashionable in the 30s for Western, well-educated Western lads and lasses to become secret spies for the greater good over in Soviet Russia. Boy, were they disillusioned. Anyway, that never ends. That keeps repeating itself. But anyway, Al is correct, quite correct. The British are still have some items classified. For example, their use of stage musicians to improvise as needed, camouflage, effective camouflage or aerial or satellite deception systems. The Maskelyne family contributed at least one. I think it was Hugh Maskelyne. This was a third generation stage musician. These are the guys who did all sorts of wonderful things with illusions. That's still popular. But anyway, they enlisted these guys very covertly, and they developed techniques which are very effective.
Yeah,
the key in the victory in North Africa, the first victory in Alamein.
The one that most impressed me, I've read the book, and I'm an amateur magician, but there was a book that was produced that basically they were using unclassified material, but they sort of figured out some of the things that had gone on. And one of the things that they had done was, I think it was Alexandria. They had done a blackout in Alexandria, but they had built a scale model of this, not of the city, but of the city lights, and set it off to the side, and so that got bombed instead of Alexandria.
Yeah. Well, the same thing. They simple little deceptions, like when they started lobbing V2s at London. After the first one or two hits, the Brits began reporting that they weren't hitting London; they were hitting east of London. So the Germans, jiggered the fuel supply so that they would go a little further, which meant that they were hitting in farmland west of London instead of hitting in London.
Yeah, again, that's where double cross came in handy, and it was it only worked if you kept the secret protected. And the Germans never found out. In fact, that was another deception. They had a special detainment, a prison camp for the senior officers. And before they moved, and these were quite luxurious, et cetera, but they bugged the entire place. And of course, these prisoners, high-ranking prisoners, never do it.
This has just made me think of something that we ought to do when we're finished with the history of SPI and Jim Dunnigan's efforts in wargaming, is that we ought to have you and Al for some episodes on your Dirty Little Secrets books. So,
not only that, deceit. We did one just on the history of deception and warfare from the ancient times to the future.
And that was 20 years ago. We've learned more.
Right. So we'll schedule some episodes for that in the future. Do any of you have anything to add to our episode today?
I think we covered the salient points.
Yeah, and the one thing I would say it would be a concern is that if it came to a long-term serious Cold War issue between the U.S. and China, we would have a disadvantage in building new ships.
Ah, yes.
Yeah. Now, it's true that their carriers are smaller and less capable than ours, but if they can build 3 or 4 of them in the same time that we can build only one, there were points in the Second World War where one carrier was a hell of a lot more useful than none. And that's the sort of thing. Right now, we've got one place that can build carriers, and actually no place that can even build a Chinese-sized carrier, which is less than half, I think, the size of one of ours.
That's 60,000 tons at the latest.
Yeah,
ones.
so about 60%.
Yeah, the Chinese have plans of eventually building a Nimitz class, but they may be reined in by budget shortages and the Chinese reluctance to basically build the same thing that they criticize their foes for doing because they're so vulnerable. I think a lot of naval officers who believe in more small carriers than big carriers. But what really bothers them is the F-35B, the vertical takeoff version. In fact, we did a piece. I think we ran it on the Italian carriers.
Yeah.
The Cavour, their latest carrier, which is about 26,000 tons, about the same as an World War II Enterprise class, Essex class. That went into refit recently, so it can handle about 16 F-35Bs.
Yeah,
that's potent.
They're also building a new helicopter carrier.
Yes, right.
That will be able. So they're going to have Italy will have 3 carriers with varying capabilities.
Well, the Garibaldi is allegedly being converted to launch SLV, satellite launch vehicles. I tried like hell to get details of that, but apparently the Italians aren't even sure. But it's obviously possible. I mean, for example, the Chinese used an old Russian trick of I guess the Russians were the last one to use it, where they have a offshore barge with a cell in it. In fact, one of the seagoing satellite launchers that is currently in use by I don't know if it's us or anyway, but it's a large it looks like a offshore rig that is towed into position. But this one simply has a silo for a fairly large, actually quite large, SLV type launcher.
Yeah.
But now the satellites have gotten so much smaller, and the solid fuel SLVs are so much more popular that the Garibaldi as a space program support ship makes a lot of sense. Also, the other thing is you can move it to the equatorial waters where you get more efficient orbits with less effort, as it were. All you need to be able to do is to move the launch to the middle of the goddamn ocean. Or like the Europeans, I think their main launch facility is in one of the French or British, I think it's French, South American territories.
Yeah.
And again, for that very same reason, it's just more effective as a place to launch satellites.
Yep. Okay, well, we'll wrap it up there, gentlemen, and we'll speak to you both next time when we'll be talking about Empire of the Middle Ages and the 100 Years' War. Empire of the Ages from SPI and the 100 Years' War from, I don't know what company. We didn't call ourselves a company at the time, so but from Strategy World. So we'll be talking.
I still have the Roman notes.
Oh yes, okay. We're going to do the Roman Republic if we ever got
right.
time on 100 Years' War. But anyway,
all right.
It became a big business where we couldn't compete.
All right.
Yeah.
We'll talk to you both next time. Bye.
Okay. Take care. Have a good weekend.